Today we're diving deep into some extraordinary developments. A former British civil servant now faces war crimes allegations for his work in Russian-controlled territories. Parliament just declared the UK utterly unprepared for conflict. A convicted extremist might receive compensation for his prison conditions. Poland accuses Russia of orchestrating railway sabotage across Europe. And a mysterious Russian spy vessel is operating off Scotland's coast, allegedly blinding British pilots with lasers. But I've saved the most fascinating story for the very end of this episode, something that perfectly captures the absurdity of our current political moment. I spent years inside one of Britain's most respected media organizations, watching how inconvenient facts got quietly shelved, how narratives got shaped to fit predetermined conclusions. I saw the machinery up close, the careful editing, the strategic omissions. Eventually, I had to make a choice between career security and intellectual honesty. So I walked away. Now I work independently, answer to no corporate board, and tell you what the establishment would rather you didn't hear too clearly. And listen, I need to ask something from you directly from the heart. What we do here, this independent fact-checking, this refusal to simply repeat official talking points, it takes real work. We verify sources, we cross-reference claims, we push back against misinformation from all sides. If you find value in that, if you appreciate having a space where the news isn't pre-filtered through corporate interests, please hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and if you're able, consider sponsoring our work. It genuinely makes a difference in keeping this operation independent and thorough. And please, stay with me until the end, because I promise you, the final story is the one that ties everything together in the most unexpected way. So, let's begin with a name many of you probably recognize: Graham Phillips, the British-born commentator who's been operating in Russian-controlled territories for years now. The Sun newspaper calls him the Kremlin Brit. Others have different names for him. Phillips is now under investigation by British authorities, specifically the Anti-Terrorism Unit, for suspected violations of the Geneva Convention and potential war crimes. What exactly are we talking about here? According to reports, Phillips filmed disturbing footage showing pigs feeding on bodies identified as Ukrainian soldiers in the Donbas region. He also conducted what's being described as a mock interrogation of captured British fighter Aidan Aslin, filming him in handcuffs, allegedly taunting him during the process. Phillips has acknowledged his involvement in both incidents, but denies any wrongdoing, framing his actions as journalism supporting Russia's position in the conflict. No arrests have been made yet, but if charges are filed, he would become the first British citizen prosecuted for war crimes since the Ukraine conflict began. Now, here's what makes this particularly significant. This isn't just about one individual's choices. It's about how modern conflicts blur the lines between journalism, propaganda, and potential complicity in violations of international law. Where exactly is that boundary? When does reporting become participation? These are questions that matter far beyond this single case. But keep watching, because the pattern of British responses to Russian activities gets even more revealing as we move through today's stories. Meanwhile, the conflict itself escalated dramatically, with one of the most intensive Russian missile and drone strikes on Ukraine in months. We're talking about a massive, coordinated assault targeting 16 regions, hitting residential buildings, critical infrastructure, and power stations. The attacks triggered fires, caused widespread power outages, and prompted an extraordinary response from NATO members. Poland and other alliance countries scrambled fighter jets and early warning aircraft, putting air defense systems on full combat alert. Think about that for a moment. NATO countries activating military responses to activities in Ukrainian airspace. That's the level of tension we're operating at now. Kyiv immediately condemned the strikes as deliberate actions targeting civilian infrastructure. And here's where the timing gets interesting. The assault coincided with two significant diplomatic developments. First, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was in Ankara meeting with representatives of Donald Trump's team. Second, reports emerged of secret negotiations between the United States and Russia, discussions happening without Ukrainian participation, exploring potential peace agreements. So you've got massive military strikes occurring simultaneously with backdoor diplomatic conversations. Is that coincidence, or is this Russia demonstrating its capabilities and resolve while peace terms are being quietly discussed? I'll let you draw your own conclusions, but the optics are certainly striking. And if you're wondering why I keep emphasizing these connections, why I'm not just listing events in isolation, it's because that's exactly what mainstream coverage tends to do. They'll report the strikes, they'll mention the diplomacy, but connecting those dots, asking what it means when military escalation and peace talks happen simultaneously, that's often left as an exercise for the viewer. Well, we're doing that exercise together right here. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on whether these negotiations can succeed while military operations intensify. I'm genuinely curious what you think, and your engagement helps push this content to more people who need to see it. Now let's shift to something that's caused considerable controversy within Britain itself. Video footage emerged from Wethersfield, the largest asylum processing centre in the UK, located on a former military base in Essex. The clips show migrants dancing under disco lights, complete with a full light show setup, and in separate footage, physical altercations breaking out within the facility. The recordings are reportedly from before the Labour government took power in July of last year, but they've resurfaced now as Home Secretary Yvette Cooper moves to tighten asylum policies. Local residents near the centre have been actively opposing plans to expand the facility, particularly frustrating given that Sir Keir Starmer explicitly promised to close it before taking office. But here is where the situation gets more complex than simple outrage or simple sympathy allows. Staff members at the centre describe conditions involving rats, severe overcrowding, and unsanitary environments. Human rights advocates have labelled the facility an open-air prison that damages the psychological well-being of residents. So what are we actually looking at? A system that simultaneously appears too comfortable in some footage and deeply inadequate in other accounts. That contradiction tells you something important about how asylum processing has become more about political messaging than coherent policy. It satisfies neither those who want strict border controls nor those advocating for humane treatment of asylum seekers. It's a muddled compromise that arguably fails everyone involved. Here's a story that perfectly encapsulates certain tensions in how rights and security intersect. Sahab Abu, 31 years old, convicted of preparing attacks for ISIS, may now receive financial compensation from the British government. Why? The High Court in London ruled that his isolation in prison, kept in solitary confinement for over 22 hours daily with minimal human contact, violated his human rights and caused post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's be clear about who we're discussing. This individual was sentenced to life imprisonment in 2021 for attempting to organise attacks in London. He was a resident of East London, described in some press coverage as an aspiring rapper turned extremist. Prison authorities held him in isolated blocks, specifically because he posed a radicalization threat to other inmates and potential dangers to staff. Despite those documented security concerns, the court determined that the isolation inflicted excessive psychological harm warranting compensation. Now, I want you to sit with that complexity for a moment. On one hand, even convicted individuals retain certain human rights, even in prison. The principle that the state cannot impose cruel treatment has deep roots in liberal democracy. On the other hand, this person actively planned to take innocent lives in terrorist attacks. The security concerns that led to his isolation weren't abstract or theoretical. So where's the balance? How do you protect both the rights of dangerous offenders and the safety of everyone around them? The court has answered that question, but I suspect many viewers might answer it differently. This is exactly the kind of nuance that gets lost when we retreat into simplistic positions on either extreme. And speaking of security concerns, let's discuss something that should alarm every British citizen regardless of political affiliation. A Parliamentary Defence Committee has issued a stark assessment. Britain is not prepared to defend itself or its allies from attack and remains far from the NATO leadership role it claims. Read that again. Not prepared to defend itself. This isn't opposition scaremongering. This is a parliamentary committee whose job is oversight and assessment. Their report highlights Britain's heavy dependence on the United States for intelligence capabilities, satellite systems, logistics, and even aerial refueling. The UK lacks a comprehensive missile defence system. The committee called for accelerated industrial modernisation and demanded that military readiness become a genuine priority, criticising the sluggish pace of civil defence strengthening. But here's what makes this particularly relevant right now. Against that backdrop of admitted unpreparedness, Britain announced plans to establish mass production of explosives and rocket components for the first time in decades. The Ministry of Defence has identified 13 potential sites for new factories across counties including Cumbria, Shropshire, Essex and Hampshire. The first facility is slated for construction next year, with production designated for both British forces and Ukraine. Defense Secretary John Healey framed this as a fundamental pivot toward reviving industrial regions and strengthening national independence in defense capabilities. Now, let me ask you something. If they're only beginning to build these factories, if the first one won't be operational until next year, do you think the plan is simply to stockpile explosives and missiles in warehouses indefinitely? Or might there be expectations about future use that aren't being explicitly stated? Think about that trajectory. Let's hit pause on the alarming security assessments and turn to economic matters, because they affect your daily life more immediately. UK inflation dropped for the first time in 5 months, falling from 3.8% to 3.6% in October. That sounds like good news, and in some ways it is. The primary driver was moderate growth in gas and electricity prices following changes to the price cap set by energy regulator Ofgem. This creates conditions for the Bank of England to potentially lower interest rates after the upcoming budget announcement from Chancellor Rachel Reeves on November 26th. Reeves promised to continue fighting price increases and reduce living costs while simultaneously cutting government debt and addressing NHS waiting lists. Quite the ambitious agenda. But before you celebrate too enthusiastically, consider the full picture. Food inflation actually rose to nearly 5%, increasing pressure on families already struggling with cost of living challenges. Despite the improvement, Britain's inflation rate remains the highest among G7 countries. Economists aren't ruling out the possibility of inflation rising again next month. So yes, the trend moved in a positive direction, but we're hardly out of the woods. Britain still faces higher price growth than other major developed economies, and the gains could easily reverse. What's particularly frustrating is watching politicians claim victory for modest improvements in problems that shouldn't have reached these levels in the first place. And if you're feeling that frustration too, let me know in the comments. Are you seeing any real relief in your household expenses, or does this inflation data feel disconnected from your actual experience? Chancellor Reeves is preparing budget measures aimed at reducing gas and electricity bills for millions of British households. The options under consideration include cutting or eliminating the 5% VAT on energy and removing green levies from electricity tariffs to lower costs for consumers. The decision comes as expenses rise with the arrival of colder weather, and advocacy organisations are demanding more decisive action, particularly for elderly and low-income citizens. Many are currently forced to economize on heating, choosing between warmth and other necessities. Beyond energy support, the government is discussing potentially removing the cap on child benefits to reduce poverty levels. Reeves promises the budget will protect the National Health Service and social services without raising income tax. Additional revenue will supposedly come from taxing the wealthy. How that will actually play out remains to be seen. Conservative Party leader Kemi Badenoch has warned that Britain faces bankruptcy if Rachel Reeves's government raises taxes without cutting welfare spending. She argues that Labour's plans to remove the two-child benefit cap would require an additional £8.5 billion and trigger a tax explosion. Badenoch stated that Conservatives would restore the restrictions, calling it a matter of fairness, and criticised the idea of raising taxes to fund social support. Labour and Liberal Democrats accused Conservatives of wanting to return to an era of harsh austerity, claiming their policies would result in cuts to schools, healthcare and policing. There's not much to add here except to note that money is always insufficient everywhere. Each party accuses the other of either heartless cruelty or reckless spending. Meanwhile, actual families are caught in the middle of these political chess games, trying to figure out how to make ends meet regardless of which party claims the moral high ground. Britain is experiencing record levels of parcel delivery problems, precisely when people are trying to order items online for the upcoming holidays. According to Citizens Advice, approximately 15 million people have complained about failures with their most recent delivery. 37% of users reported difficulties, most commonly couriers leaving before doors were answered, parcels left in unsafe locations where they were stolen, or companies simply delaying deliveries outright. A rating of major services showed Royal Mail received 3.25 out of 5, while Yodel once again ranked worst with 2 points. The organisation accused companies of chronically violating standards and called for Ofcom to impose strict oversight and fines. Nearly half of customers encountered problems when filing complaints, and accessibility for people with disabilities decreased despite new regulatory requirements. Let me just pause here and acknowledge how infuriating this must be. You order something, you arrange your schedule to be home, you pay for delivery, and the system fails at multiple points with no real accountability. It's the kind of everyday dysfunction that erodes trust in institutions far more effectively than any grand scandal. These aren't abstract policy failures. They're concrete frustrations that affect millions of people trying to handle basic logistics. And when you can't even count on parcels arriving as promised, it reinforces a broader sense that systems are breaking down, that the basic competencies we used to take for granted are vanishing. Am I overstating it? Maybe, but I don't think I am. The Parliamentary Committee on Public Spending has declared that the National Health Service is failing to deliver on promises to reduce waiting lists, despite billions in investment and recovery plans. According to their report, improvements have stalled. 7.4 million patients are waiting for scheduled care. 192,000 have been waiting over a year. And 22% of patients wait more than 6 weeks just for diagnostic testing, not even actual medical treatment yet. The committee blamed Keir Starmer's government and Health Secretary Wes Streeting for an unplanned, expensive system reform that may actually worsen quality of care. Authorities defend their policies, stating they inherited an already broken NHS and have achieved a reduction in waiting lists by 230,000 people so far. But experts warn that targets for 2026 may prove unattainable. Here's what strikes me about this ongoing NHS crisis. Every government inherits a broken system from the previous government, makes grand promises about fixing it, implements reforms that may or may not improve anything, then hands off an equally broken or worse system to the next government who makes the same promises. It's a cycle that suggests the problem isn't primarily about political will or even necessarily about funding levels. It's structural. The model itself may no longer be viable in its current form, but suggesting fundamental restructuring is political suicide. So instead, we get perpetual tinkering around the edges while patients suffer through unacceptable wait times. I'm not offering solutions here because I'm not convinced anyone has genuinely good solutions that are also politically feasible. But recognizing that we're stuck in a doom loop seems like a necessary starting point. Now let's talk about something considerably lighter, though it speaks volumes about public sentiment. A television presenter, Patrick Christys of GB News, received an anonymous gift from a viewer, Christmas-themed toilet paper featuring the face of Labour leader Keir Starmer. Christys thanked the generous donor during his live broadcast, but notably did not demonstrate the product's use on air. The packaging included jokes deemed too bold for television, so the full contents remained a mystery to viewers. Whatever your political views, you have to admit there's something beautifully British about expressing political dissatisfaction through novelty toilet paper. It's creative dissent that harms no one and makes a point through absurdity. In an era of increasingly heated political rhetoric, maybe we could use more humor and less rage, though I suspect Sir Keir might not fully appreciate the comedic value. Defence Secretary John Healey has announced that a Russian intelligence vessel, the Yantar, is operating off Scotland's northern coast and allegedly blinding British pilots with lasers. He warned Moscow that London is closely monitoring the situation and prepared to take action if the ship approaches British waters. Healey called for transitioning into a new era of hard power, noting the growth of global threats, including conflict between Israel and Iran, Chinese espionage, and ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine as reasons for strengthening the country's defensive readiness. This story comes accompanied by footage showing what British media presents as evidence of these activities, including interviews with military personnel and demonstrations of the alleged laser incidents. Here's what's significant. This isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern that British authorities and media are increasingly framing as coordinated hybrid warfare. Which brings us to our next story. Polish authorities have reported a series of sabotage operations targeting railways, allegedly organized with Russian intelligence involvement as part of a broader hybrid warfare campaign aimed at undermining Western unity and support for Ukraine. Polish officials stated they've detained dozens of people, including foreigners, recruited through Telegram and paid in cryptocurrency to conduct arson attacks and explosions. Similar activities are reportedly occurring in other countries. British newspaper The Eye specifically highlights that in 2023, Ukrainian-linked warehouses were set on fire in London, and there have been cyber attacks plus appearances of Russian intelligence ships near British shores. According to experts, Moscow is using networks of disposable operatives to create chaos without crossing the threshold into direct military conflict. EU intelligence services believe Russia is testing impact methods and may intensify such operations in the future, making the threat to Europe and Britain only grow. Now, think about how this connects to everything else we've discussed. Unprepared defenses, spy ships off the coast, sabotage networks across Europe, diplomatic negotiations happening alongside military operations. What you're witnessing is conflict that doesn't fit neat categories. It's not peace, but it's not conventional war either. It exists in this grey zone where attribution is difficult, responses are complicated, and the cumulative effect is destabilization without clear red lines being crossed. That ambiguity is precisely the point. Before we wrap up, I want to mention something that truly captures the strangeness of our current moment in Britain. London is hosting a festival called Month of the Dead throughout November, dedicated to death culture and Victorian mourning traditions. The program includes lectures on death masks, workshops on taxidermy, walks through plague pits and historic cemeteries, a candlelit requiem concert, and an event titled Death and Debauchery. Particularly notable is a presentation by Dr. John Troyer, who worked with King Charles on environmentally friendly burial methods, including composting human remains. Yes, you read that correctly. King Charles has expressed considerable interest in this topic. Tickets for these events are sold separately, with prices starting at £12, and advance booking is recommended. I'm not going to moralize about whether this festival is appropriate or inappropriate. What interests me is what it reveals about a culture increasingly comfortable exploring death as entertainment while simultaneously struggling with actual mortality in overstretched healthcare systems, unable to adequately support elderly citizens through winter, debating whether convicted attackers deserve compensation for psychological suffering. There's a disconnect there, a society aestheticizing death as cultural performance while failing to handle the practical realities of caring for the vulnerable. Maybe I'm reading too much into a quirky festival, or maybe these contradictions matter. So let's bring this all together. We've covered a former British operative facing war crimes allegations, massive strikes on Ukraine happening during peace negotiations, asylum centres satisfying nobody, courts ordering compensation for isolated offenders, parliamentary admissions of military unpreparedness alongside plans to build weapons factories, economic indicators showing marginal improvements in ongoing crises, delivery systems failing, healthcare waiting lists growing, novelty toilet paper mocking the Prime Minister, Russian vessels near Scotland, sabotage networks across Europe, and festivals celebrating death culture. What connects these disparate stories? They're all symptoms of systems under strain, institutions losing coherence, contradictions multiplying faster than they can be resolved. We live in a moment where nothing quite makes sense in isolation, but the overall pattern suggests profound instability beneath surfaces that still pretend to normalcy. Britain is simultaneously unprepared for conflict and planning weapons production, promising lower bills while inflation remains highest in the G7, reforming healthcare while waiting lists grow, processing asylum seekers in conditions described as both too comfortable and inhumane, investigating one British citizen for war crimes while monitoring Russian hybrid warfare operations. These aren't bugs in the system. This is what systemic breakdown looks like before it becomes undeniable. If you found value in this analysis, if you appreciate someone willing to connect dots that often remain scattered across separate headlines, please hit that like button and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to see it. And if you're able to sponsor this channel, it directly supports the kind of independent work that digs deeper than surface-level reporting. We're not beholden to corporate interests or political parties. We're accountable to you, to accuracy, to asking difficult questions even when the answers are uncomfortable. That's increasingly rare, and it only continues if viewers like you make it possible. Thank you for watching, for thinking critically, for engaging with complexity rather than retreating into simplistic narratives. Until next time, stay informed, stay skeptical, and never stop asking why.